My journey with their jaws, the famous sharks from Mossel Bay, began as Rod said, back in the early 90s, and it really has been an incredible journey. Like that little shark you see on the bottom of the screen. When I first started working with them, I had absolutely no idea the path it would take me on, what I would see, the love I would have for these animals, and also the heartache that I would feel with their disappearance. So it really has been a journey, not only learning about how the sharks move, but also a personal journey. So like many people that are involved with wildlife in Southern Africa, my passion came from a very early age. I was very privileged as a young boy to be taken to all the game reserves in Southern Africa. And as such, through exposure to wildlife, I became very passionate about it and wanted to learn and essentially work with these animals from the earliest of days. When we moved to the Cape, my interest from terrestrial animals obviously took a marine slant, and I started a project with the local trek net fishermen. These are the guys that row little boats out and encircle shoals of fish, and at that time they were catching a lot of sharks. Sadly, they were killing a lot of sharks because the public was putting pressure on them to kill them. But we started a tag and release program with them, whereby we tagged over 1,500 sharks and probably released nearly 5,000 of them. And in 1991, we caught a little great white shark in the nets, tagged the animal, and I took the information to the only group that was working with great whites at the time, the White Shark Research Institute. And I volunteered with them for 4 years, primarily in Dyer Island, Fransbaai, and also at Struisbaai. And it was the most wonderful learning exposure. You know, it was in the pioneering days. There wasn't much cage diving. And it was really just people that were passionate about the sharks and had no ulterior financial motives or anything like that. So I got great exposure to them. At the same time, I started doing research into a tiny little island in Mossel Bay. Mossel Bay is, to me, one of the most beautiful places on the planet. Described in 1495 by Bartholomew Dias as Cabo Tormentosa, the Cape of Storms. And less than 100 years later, by the famous British explorer Sir Francis Drake, as the fairest cape in all of the world. And indeed, it has these tremendous moods, either incredibly tempestuous or amazingly beautiful. Lying at the center of this amazing bay is what I would say is the jewel in the crown itself, and that is Seal Island. It's a small shelving of rock, roughly 400 meters long by 80 meters wide, and is home to an incredible 65,000 Cape fur seals, which makes it Africa's largest island-bound seal colony. What I noticed from a very early time was that not only were there a lot of seals in the area, but there was also incredible other marine wildlife. And at certain times of the year, we would regularly see schools of dolphin numbering well in excess of 1,000 animals. Would have almost sardine run like bait balls in Mossel Bay with thousands of gannets diving into them. Obviously, there was a seasonal intrusion of whales, and later we started seeing orcas as well. So Mossel Bay was, to me, the equivalent of the Serengeti of the sea. But it was one animal around this island that I guess changed my life and gave me the most incredible career, and that was finding great white sharks at Seal Island. There have been several exploratory trips there before a colleague and I went to the island during the summer months, because people in those days used to think you'd find great white sharks when the seals were pupping, but actually during the summer months they're feeding inshore on a variety of other prey species that I'll talk about a bit later. Not only did we find great white sharks at Seal Island in the winter months, and great white sharks are pretty spectacular animals just on their own, but we found the most amazing flying great white sharks. And unbeknownst to us at the time, this phenomena had not really been seen anywhere else in the world. And quickly, when the first images came out, it started attracting global attention. When we started seeing these sharks performing unbelievably acrobatic feats of athleticism, it was just remarkable to us what these animals were truly capable of. When the first film crews started coming, quickly the word spread, The first major shoot we did was in the late 1990s with a National Geographic film crew with, ironically, the man who wrote Jaws at the time. And it was quite interesting being on the boat with him and chatting to him and hearing his take on everything. And you know, all these years later, he became a firm supporter of great white sharks. But very interesting at the time. That initial film crew with Peter Benchley, David Duboulet was a very famous photographer, Rodney Fox, the most famous shark attack victim in the world, was really a stepping stone for us in that it gave us great exposure. And I became friends with a gentleman you see on the right of your screens, a guy by the name of Jeff Kerr, who was Discovery Channel's most famous shark director, producer for Shark Week. And we started a career around about 2000, working together, putting together these shows, highlighting the incredible behavior at Seal Island. And really, when the world got to see this behavior for the first time in ultra slow motion, in the early years, we were using military cameras that were using technology used for checking ballistics. It allowed us to see in unbelievable detail things we couldn't see before. So these seals gaping as they're going through the air, taking a breath, how they move within their own groups as anti-predatory strategies, and then the unbelievable power, athleticism, and beauty of 1,000-kilogram great white shark bursting out of the water. And audiences were transfixed. As somebody who was just a passionate young guy, crazy about sharks, I had no idea how many people felt exactly the same way. And particularly in, ironically, the Northern Hemisphere, the interest in these flying great white sharks was simply phenomenal. For us, what we started learning is all sorts of different things about how the sharks breach, why they breach, how they utilize the island. And we started seeing incredibly big sharks using the same behavior. In this case, a shark probably weighing 1,500 kilograms, 5.5 meters in length, an adult great white breaching. I was lucky over the years, having spent thousands of days at that island, to see great white sharks doing the most incredible things against a stormy sky, and then almost like a dancer stage lit on a screen. Just beautiful to watch. Back home in the US, the interest was simply phenomenal. And you can see just some of the statistics there. Literally nearly 40 million people watch Shark Week every year. And what South Africans didn't realize is the backbone of Shark Week was actually the breaching great white sharks in False Bay, and then also further down our coast in Gansbaai and Mossel Bay. And the world was transfixed by these animals. They started coming out, and we started experimenting with all sorts of different craft to get different angles. They towed me in a tiny little sled where, as a wildlife photographer, it gave me a chance to get low angles of the breaching sharks and see them hunting in a way as I guess only seals really did. And it was just the most amazing opportunity to do things that very few people actually had ever done. It was humbling to have these opportunities. We started using all sorts of crazy technology, sometimes quite scary stuff, like this huge crane that if it moved just a few degrees too much, it would fall off the boat. Before drones, we were using remote controlled helicopters to try and film the breaches. And then even gas turbine helicopters with rotor blades of around about 6 foot in length that made all of us duck and dive for cover every time the nervous pilot had landed on a pitching and rolling deck. Over the years, we really tried to push back the veneer of secrecy surrounding the sharks, and we started diving at night with them and seeing how they reacted to lights. We struck very close affiliations with various scientists, both abroad and in South Africa, to try and learn more about the animals, because it was only by learning more about them that we could know the threats that they faced and also where these animals were moving and what could be done to protect them. One of the scientists I worked with a lot overseas was a guy by the name of Dr. Neil Hammerschlag, one of the world's foremost shark scientists. And we did various projects and research papers together. We did a lot of work at night where we were using very powerful sonar to actually see the movements of the seals and the movements of the sharks, and really try and understand how these animals were hunting at night. Cage diving or free diving with great white sharks by day is an amazing experience, but when you do it at night, you really realize just how formidable these animals are. They appear and disappear like ghosts in the darkness, and you just get this little hint of white as they come in and out of frame. And I can only imagine for a seal, it must be like being hunted by a phantom. And it's even more remarkable that the seals escape on roughly 50% of all hunts. What was truly amazing is just the success of these sharks hunting at night. And obviously we were watching them primarily hunting seals, but we also did shape discrimination studies with decoys, and we thought the sharks would really struggle to hit them. But they hit them with unerring accuracy. And we learned very quickly that not sight, but rather sound and vibration were the primary cues for a great white locating and then honing in on its prey. Because often the water was, by virtue of the fact that it was night, pitch black, and often the visibility was almost zero just because there was a lot of turbidity. So it was impossible for the sharks to see the decoy, but remarkably, they found it every time. Probably the most amazing thing that we filmed during the different shows, and maybe the most amazing thing I was ever fortunate enough with our team to see, was in June 2000, we had a whale carcass at Seal Island. The Navy were going to blow it up on a beach in Glencairn and cause all sorts of probably environmental disasters, and maybe cars being crushed by landing chunks of whale meat, as has happened in different parts of the world. And anyhow, we came up with a more environmentally sound plan of towing it to the island and letting nature take its course. And we watched at least 28 great whites, possibly as many 40, feeding on this 11-meter whale carcass for roughly 2 days. And in 18 hours, they ate 60% of the whale. And to be right next to this carcass with these huge great white sharks, with their pectoral fins overlapping, taking 50-pound chunks of flesh at a time, was simply incredible. We had another opportunity in 2010, and on this time we were filming for the BBC's show Africa, and we put a cage in next to the carcass, and we were able to get eye-level shots of the sharks coming in. And it was just incredible to see how these animals gorged themselves on the carcass, because not only was it a freely available meal, but it was an incredibly energy and fat-rich meal. And they would literally strip the carcass of its blubber, much like you would have a lamb spit or a rotisserie turning in the water. So as they stripped the blubber, the flotation would disappear and it would roll perfectly for the sharks to actually eat more. But what we learned is that the fat and energy-rich component to the white shark's diet is vital to it. And you could see how they purposely target these fat-rich areas on the carcass itself. Moving up the coast, I spent many years working around Dyer Island in Gansbaai, and one of the things I loved most about this area is during the summer months, the large sharks often move inshore, and with many projects that we were involved in, we used all sorts of different crafts and contraptions to get closer to the sharks and learn more about them. We also put little cameras on the seafloor, and for the first time, this reinforced what we already had an inclination to, and that was that when the sharks are inshore, which is usually for around about 7, sometimes 8 months of the year, they're actually going inshore, and these are the great whites, they're going inshore to feed on smaller shark species. And the camera quickly showed us, where we had the high density numbers of great whites, that there were also very high densities of smaller sharks, such as smoothhound sharks, supin sharks, bronze whalers, and then a whole host of endemic species. We used various underwater cages to film what was going on, and around Dyer Island, what we saw was great white sharks swimming in the kelp, which for many people, they thought that safety was provided by the refuge of the kelp, but indeed there were a couple of great whites that became specialists of navigating through the channels around Dyer Island and actually hunting successfully in these kelp beds. One of the highlights for me in the Gansbaai area was paddle boarding with great whites, and I think a lot of people, when they see an image like this, they think you're crazy. But I equate it to experienced rangers who walk in the bush with lions. You do a lot by reading body language. And in the case of the great whites, what people don't realize, it's actually very difficult to get close to them. If I paddled directly towards that animal, it would dive and move away from me. And only by letting the shark choose to follow me and finally become comfortable would it swim around and actually interact with me. And it was just an amazing experience, an incredibly humbling experience. One of the crazier projects that I was involved with, and that's not me on that shark cutout, it's a young guy by the name of Dickie Shivel in Gansbaai, was where we put a large silhouette of a great white in the water to see how other great whites would react. And what was truly incredible is when Dickie was on it, the sharks would circle him, but wouldn't be comfortable coming in. The moment he got off that craft, the sharks instinctively knew that something was different. There was something that they were now comfortable with. Was something the person not on the, by not being on the cutout was what they were most uncomfortable with. And when Dickie got off, the sharks would come in and actually bite that silhouette. So they have a threshold for their own comfort levels. They're very aware of what's going on. And around Dyer Island, we also saw some really large sharks. In this particular case, we were pulling a craft behind a boat where we were filming a breach from underwater to see just how these animals follow and then ultimately launch an attack on a surface-borne object. The Gansbaai had similarities to Seal Island in False Bay, in that there were large numbers of sharks. You had an island with a seal colony, but by virtue of the fact that Dyer Island was surrounded by massive beds of kelp, large rock structures, and lots of other places for the seals to hide, you saw a fraction of the natural predatory behavior that Seal Island and False Bay became so famous for. Another location I enjoy visiting and has got large numbers of great white sharks, generally smaller animals, but of late we've been seeing quite a large number of bigger sharks there. And it's also home to a cage diving operation that we've got good relationships with, and then also a really great researcher in South Africa by the name of Enrico Gennari, who does a lot of conservation work there. We've had a lot of fantastic experiences there, and what makes Mossel Bay truly unique in the world of white sharks is its unbelievably close proximity to land. So you can be sitting on the beach and watching great white sharks hunt. And if you're familiar with the surroundings of Mossel Bay, essentially on roughly about 220, 240 degrees, you have land, condominiums, hotels, apartments, all surrounding this tiny little island that lies no more than about 800 meters offshore. And remarkably, despite huge numbers of people being in the water, and the great white sharks, particularly at this time of the year, attacking seals on a daily basis, there are very, very few incidences involving sharks and humans. Over the years, there have been many crazy projects that I've been involved in, and when you're working with documentary crews and they tell you they're going to send you a submarine, it sounds fantastic. And you almost feel like James Bond, but what they don't tell you is the submarine's not quite a James Bond-like submarine. It's a submarine that's essentially cut in half. And whilst your head may be dry, everything else is wet and your bum actually sticks out the back. So when you're going underwater and you watch a great white shark in front of you, it's awesome. But the moment it swims behind you and you know your bum's sticking out, I can tell you, you pucker up those cheeks a lot more than normal. And yeah, that was a fun and crazy experience. And I definitely wouldn't recommend a half submarine for anybody who's keen to try it out. What was a fantastic experience in this area was kayaking with great white sharks. A large part of what I do in the documentaries is try and show people through my own actions that whilst, yes, they're predators, yes, we must respect them, great white sharks, for the most part, have very little interest in us. And provided we don't do anything completely stupid, like swimming in amongst a shoal of fish or swimming around seals, for the most part, they choose to leave us alone. And in the 3 weeks we were doing this project, I had about 30 different great white sharks inspect me on the kayak. And in absolutely not, in absolutely no instance did they show any interest in being aggressive towards me. They would circle me and just carry on their daily activities. Mossel Bay is also home to breaching great white sharks, and what's interesting about this area is really the juxtaposition between the incredible natural spectacle of seeing these creatures flying through the air, and then these huge bulk tankers loading and offloading gas and oil in the background. And it's really an instance where wildlife and humans to a certain extent coexist. What's fascinating about Mossel Bay is, due to the large surrounding of people, you have a lot of lights at night, and research that's been done in this area shows that the sharks actually utilize the lights to aid them hunting. So by illuminating the surface-borne targets, or in the case of seals, they are helped by having more illumination from the lights. We've also filmed them at night around the island using all sorts of different technology. And it's always fascinating going out at night because white sharks obviously behave differently. And when you're diving with them or you're working with them, just the behavior at night is often quite different today. Often the sharks are actually quite scared of the lights. Some of them will come in and dart straight out, whilst others appear to become progressively more comfortable. What we also learned is that only, and particularly at Seal Island and False Bay, only certain individual sharks would actually stay around the island after dark, which lends itself to the question if these animals have perhaps become nocturnal specialists. Bear in mind, a lot of the sharks at Mossel Bay were historically smaller sharks. They're typically adolescent animals, juveniles, and just like human teenagers, they're incredibly athletic and have got huge amounts of energy to expend. So you can see sometimes the most spectacular breaches as these animals leap 10, 12 feet clear of the water. One of the interesting documentaries we were involved with in Mossel Bay was where we brought in new technology, and by not having a boat towing a decoy or around the island, we were obviously less invasive. There wasn't the boat's noise, and we towed a decoy using a drone, and with quite interesting adaptations, we took magnets, put it on the line from the drone to the decoy, and when the shark jumped, the little magnets would pull apart so the drone wouldn't be pulled out the sky. But the drone gave us an aerial view of the shark coming up, and then obviously a completely different angle to a breach as had previously been seen. One of my favorite areas in South Africa for great white sharks is one of the most recently, I guess, filmed, and I don't want to say discovered because people have known the sharks are there for a long time, but suddenly in recent years, a lot more effort has been put into trying to understand why the sharks are at Robberg and Plettenberg Bay. And you have the peninsula, and along the peninsula are seal colonies, one of which has grown tremendously in the last 10 to 15 years, and now numbers well into the thousands. And the sharks essentially patrol up and down the peninsula looking for seals. And what this means is, by virtue of the fact of the elevation that the cliffs give you, you can, for all intents and purposes, just sit there and be a voyeur in the great white shark's world. And it really has allowed us to learn a lot more about essentially the beginning and middle of a hunt, whereas at Seal Island in False Bay, we would always see the culmination and the climax to the hunt of the shark flying.
Oh, there's a seal. There's a seal. The seal's actually coming out. Look at that. Rather than staying in the inshore area where you think they're 100% safe, they're actually coming and using that rock as a backdrop with which to view the enemy.
This is fascinating.
Look how the sharks turn towards the seals, but the seals are coming out to the shark. What this really is giving us a chance to see is the whole preamble to a hunt. Before, we'd always just see the culmination, but now the whole story unfolds. It's like watching this incredible game of chess.
Okay, I'm just gonna fly a little bit further down and try and see if we can get seal and shark in frame. Yeah, there we go. There's a shark. There we go. It's just cruising. Boy, they're close.
He's
Oh,
turning.
there he goes.
Here he goes.
Yeah.
Oh! That was unbelievable. Did he get it? Did he get it?
No, they got away.
There, both of them there.
How on earth did that seal ever escape?
You can see there the little seal was named Houdini after that one, and just goes to show you how shallow these sharks will actually come. And what for me was one of the most amazing things there is to see the little trigger mechanisms. So almost like a coiled spring, you'd watch that shark's tail wind up, get ready to go, then the seal would adjust, the shark would relax, and so you had this cat and mouse hunt going on that we never knew existed before without obviously having an aerial perspective. So South Africa's great white sharks have to a large part been studied. I mean, there are other locations where great whites occur along the South African coastline, but for the most part, the three primary areas of Seal Island, Gansbaai, and Mossel Bay are pretty well known. I've worked with great white sharks all around the world, and one of my favorite locations to work with them is way down south of the South Island, of the little island called Stewart Island in New Zealand. And we go out to a small cluster of islands called the Edwards Islands. Now, this area certainly rivals South Africa for beauty. What I loved about the first few trips there was we used to go out on this old boat. It was almost 80 years old. It was kind of turning back the clock. And for those of you who bird fans, we used to have up to 4 species of albatross around the boat, these incredibly beautiful Buller's albatross, and just the most remote, beautiful, and wild location to work in. And when you go underwater, it's no less beautiful. It must be the most incredible marine landscape in the world to see great whites. It's almost like you gave a kid a box of crayons and said, just go crazy and paint the brightest, wildest colors you could ever imagine. And then this incredible predator comes cruising through. What was also fantastic to see in New Zealand, and we don't see in South Africa, is the really close proximity that great white sharks are comfortable with each other in. So generally, there's a very strong and strict hierarchy with the sharks. It's typically dictated by size. But there in New Zealand, we often saw these sharks swimming right next to each other, and just a completely different social structure to what we know from other locations. So on one side of the island, you have these incredibly beautiful marine landscapes. And then on the other side, it's almost like you've landed on the moon. And on this side in particular, we saw large numbers of small shark species called spiny dogfish. And almost certainly the great white sharks are feeding on them. And in fact, in that area, a lot of fishermen often will have great white sharks taking these spiny dogfish off their hooks. Now, working with the film shoots, I love the natural history side of things, but obviously there is an entertainment factor, and it's always a little bit of a laugh and giggle when you arrive in these places, and there's smoke machines and there are all sorts of things to reveal or hide the latest contraption they've come up with. And in this particular case, it was a craft called the Wasp, which essentially allowed me to walk along the seafloor like Freddie Flintstone. And what that allowed me to do was to position myself in the best spot to see behavior, to get obviously imagery with the best backgrounds, and also just gave me mobility along the seafloor. And being low down in this craft, when you've got a large great white swimming around you, can be a little bit unnerving. But when you land on the bottom and suddenly now you're free to walk around and see these incredible animals, it's an amazing experience. In this particular case, there's a young great white becoming a little bit too frisky, so I'm asking him if he'll just leave it as a one-man cage and not join me. But then we saw some truly incredibly big animals, and this was a shark known to the locals as Fred, spelled with a PH, but he was a shark of around about 5.5 meters in length, which is as big as the males ever get. And whilst all the other great whites were pretty relaxed and generally just circled me, Fred just came barreling in and certainly let me know who's boss.
"15 feet. Wow, that's a big Shrines Colossus range."
But then, an even larger shark appears, approaching 18 feet long with a massive girth, and easy to spot by his tiny companion, a black and white striped pilotfish. And like Colossus, this behemoth doesn't appear to like humans invading his turf.
So not your average day out underwater, but it's just an incredible example of how one animal, once it got worked up, can actually trigger the others to do the same. And then you can have exactly the opposite. So this is a shark that we got to know pretty well called Marble Tail, and he was just the most amazingly relaxed individual. And whilst I was waiting to be towed, because we were trying to see if the great whites would breach in New Zealand, suddenly Marble Tail arrived on the scene, and for probably 10 minutes or so, just quietly circled me, was gently pushing me around, and just one of those curious, gentle animals, just trying to figure out what the strange craft was in his world. Amazing to see just how different their personalities can be. So when we towed the seal sled in South Africa, we got a breach probably in 20 minutes in my case, and the one other time we did it, I think it took an hour. But in New Zealand, in temperatures around about 5 degrees, we towed the sled for 7 days for 3 hours every single morning to try and get a breach. And then finally we did. And by that stage, I think I needed a week to thaw out, but it was just an incredible spectacle to see these animals flying through the air in a different location. And of course, why shouldn't they? I mean, essentially it's the same animal, but they just use different hunting strategies in different parts of the world. We've been involved in some documentaries that sadly didn't actually make it to the screen, and this was one of my real favorites. We were looking for a salmon shark, which essentially is kind of the great white of the colder climes. It's a creature that, as the name suggests, feeds primarily on salmon, but lives in extremely cold water. And we went there to try to film these sharks naturally breaching, but sadly, due to overfishing, the breaching had actually stopped. There weren't high enough densities of them. And we got amazing footage, which was, from a conservation point of view, very powerful, of fish struggling in nets and salmon leaping from under waterfalls up streams. But just because we didn't get the breaching shot, sadly, it never made it to air. So over the years, obviously being involved with sharks for a long time, and I guess doing things that are not generally conventional, we've had a couple of interesting incidents. In 1994, I had a great white break into a cage and get into a cage with me for over a minute. Then on one particular day in Mossel Bay, when we had very, very turbid water and cloudy conditions, I could just see the shark behavior was different, and said to the guys, look, today's not a day to go on the sled or on the kayak. And I said to them, well, let's just put the kayak out there, put the paddle out, see what happens. And you can imagine if I'd been on the kayak with this guy holding onto one end of the wishbone, it would have been rather interesting to see in the outcome. On another occasion at Seal Island, we were working with a 60 Minutes crew. We had a very famous war correspondent by the name of Bob Simon in the cage. And a seal came up to the cage. There weren't any sharks around, saw Bob in the cage, was swimming around. And then suddenly a big great white arrived. And the seal looked at Bob, looked at the cage, looked at the shark, and thought, well, that cage is a really good spot to be. Climbed inside the cage, and for the next 5 minutes, a very confused great white shark was trying to figure out how to get the seal out the cage. When Bob came out, he said, well, you can forget Vietnam or the Gulf War. Those are the 5 most crazy minutes of his life. When we were filming the shark carcass, from the floating cage. We had a white shark come up right next to us and chew on the carcass next to us. And you can see the BBC cameraman's not that happy, but the shark was purely focused on the carcass. There wasn't too much to worry about. This was a really interesting encounter I had of Mexico at Guadalupe Island, where we were testing a shark repellent. We had a magnet next to the piece of tuna, and we had it with the magnet and without the magnet. And we'd put the piece of bait out, the shark would take it, and then we put it out with the magnet, and obviously it would repel it. But what I learned was, even though I was in a cage with 1/8 of an inch thick Lexan plastic, that the shark knew I was there. And if I'd had the courage or was crazy enough, I could probably have done the same experiment without the need for the cage. The shark knew exactly what the game was, knew exactly what the bait was, and was comfortable to come in that close and not even try and at any stage get me. Through the years, we've been involved in many research projects, probably the smelliest one of which was collecting seal scat on Seal Island, which was later used for stable isotope studies, where we learned through analyzing the scat that the Seal Island False Bay and Seal Island Mossel Bay seals are the most stressed out seals of any seals ever recorded. And no surprises there, they've got a horde of great white sharks swimming around the island, but very interesting nonetheless. The great whites have attracted famous people from all around the world, just a couple of them: Bill Gates, famous CBS anchor, obviously recognized Tiger Woods, Johnny Rotten. And all these people are fascinated by the great whites. Such is the attraction of these animals. But whilst it's obviously interesting working with these stars of the human world, the real stars are undoubtedly the sharks themselves. And we've got to know incredible individual sharks. The one on the bottom left is a shark we knew as Rasta, the bottom right, Cuz, the top one, Shy Guy, called Shy Guy because we saw him hunt 60 times and not once did he ever come to the boat. And it really was the natural predation for me that I think was the greatest privilege to observe. Over the years, we observed just over 10,500 predatory events at Seal Island, which is comfortably 10 times the most ever recorded anywhere else. And I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. 46 predatory events in 4 hours. And for any of you who spend a lot of time in the bush, you'll know how rare it is to see a lion catch a buffalo or a cheetah run down a springbok. Sure, you see it, but it's certainly not something you see every day. And those numbers really put into perspective just what an amazing place Seal Island was. We learned incredible things, how the sharks would, at certain times of the year, arrive at Seal Island, and in the early stages of every season, all they would do was scavenge. They'd look for sick, dead, or dying seals that they would then pick up. And for the most part, bearing in mind there weren't large numbers at the beginning of the season, that was enough to keep them satiated. But as the shark numbers grew, so they would have to start hunting active, healthy seals. We learned that they would hunt under full moons. We watched how they would try and catch birds, and in many cases succeed, but never or very seldom consume them. I think probably I may have seen up to 50 birds being caught by the sharks over the years, and probably could count on one hand how many they actually consumed. Sometimes, remarkably, the birds survived. We saw full-grown great whites swallow Cape cormorants, release them, bird would pop up to the surface, shake itself and fly off, no doubt with a story that no other birds would ever believe. Most amazing, though, were the seals themselves, right up at the food chain, top predators, but how they would leave the island in well-organized groups, with the seals on the sides and the back jostling for position in the group and causing a confusing herd effect, much like you see with a herd of zebra running away from a lion. It made catching them that much more difficult. And when the sharks were hunting groups of seals, the success rate dropped to around about 15%. That changed quite dramatically when they started targeting young of the year single seals. Suddenly the success rate went up to over 70% at Seal Island. We also learned that the seals have incredibly strong social bonds, and when an injured animal would return to the island, it was quickly investigated by many others. Over the years, we saw the most unbelievable hunts, learnt the most incredible things. We learnt that the sharks are capable of catching their prey out of the water and visually track the seals through the air. You can see how this shark is opening its mouth in the air, turning its body, trying to catch that seal as best it can. Sometimes the seals were incredibly efficient at dodging the sharks, and the sharks missed by a country mile. And then on other occasions, they escaped by the most miraculous of means. I'm sure we all remember that cartoon of the frog strangling the heron's neck that says, "Never give up," whilst the frog's halfway down its throat. Well, in this case, the seal has done the most amazing escape. And over here, even closer, pushing itself out of the shark's mouth using the teeth as a final point of leverage, and then almost unbelievably balancing on a razor's edge. But the sharks, just like everything else, needed to feed and were incredibly successful hunters. Successful in over 49% of all hunts, so call it 50-50, and just incredibly efficient. Somebody asked me, if a large predator was to catch and kill me, what would I like it to be? And undoubtedly, I'd say a great white shark, because it's over so quickly. They catch their prey, tear it in half in seconds, swim around, pick up the other pieces, and it's game over. For the seals, those that make it back to the island truly are the Olympians of the natural world, and every one, to me, deserves a medal. Truly incredible animals. And like the terrestrial equivalents, nothing goes to waste. When a seal's killed, there's always a bird to pick up those scraps, and the cycle of life continues. And for me, it was always a reminder of generally how wasteful we are as humans. So you've seen the great side of the great whites, but unfortunately for these animals, what we were seeing 10, 15 years ago isn't the case today. The great white shark's under huge pressure in South African waters. There are a lot of theories why, one of which is orcas, and certainly orcas have played their part. We know in Mossel Bay that several great white sharks have been killed in that area by killer whales. At Seal Island, however, in 2009, we started seeing killer whales at the island. We recorded them in False Bay on over 40 different occasions. And my wife and I were lucky enough to go on 23 different hunts with the orcas, and they were primarily feeding on dolphins. And amazingly, we watched them with exactly the same background of Cape Point, one hunting a Cape for the great white, the Cape fur seal, and the orcas diving into the dolphins. And we noticed absolutely no decline in great white shark numbers or distribution or behavior at Seal Island while the orcas were there. So why do we think the great white sharks have disappeared from the coastal waters of False Bay and France Bay and are starting to see different distribution shifts along the rest of our coastline? And we firmly believe that it's linked to the disappearance of what is actually the great white's primary food source, and that is smaller sharks. So the great whites would come to the island colonies in South Africa from roughly around about April every year and stay there to September. They would then move inshore, and for the balance of the year, so say 7 months, would be going to the areas of the high densities of these smaller sharks. And around about the mid-2000s into 2010, 2012, a new fishery really started kicking into gear in South Africa, and that was the demersal shark longline fishery that started actively targeting these smaller sharks. Sadly, despite scientists continually pushing for various new measures to protect the sharks, very little has been done, and fisheries managers continually ignore these recommendations, some of which you can see here. A synopsis of that is basically total allowable catch, or TAC, was recommended of 75 tons in 2016, and in 2016, 123 tons, 2017, 128, 2018, 211, 2019, at least 165, and this year the carnage continues. The stocks of these animals are under huge pressure. We know in the case of the soupfin shark, they 90% likely dramatically overfished. In the case of of the smooth-hound shark, at least 60%. And certainly in the areas where we work, particularly False Bay, which had an abundance of these animals, and that's where you found the great whites in the summer months, they've completely disappeared. This graph here gives you an idea just the state to which these animals are being overfished. The big thick purple line is the recommended total allowable catch, and you can see just how that's been ignored by the fishery and by fisheries management. Sadly, not only are the target species being essentially annihilated, but also a lot of protected species such as hammerheads and great whites. And the fishery claims zero bycatch, but these are images that we and other people have taken, clearly showing that's not the case. They're actively fishing in some of South Africa's flagship marine protected areas, such as De Hoop, and here catching protected species in this area. As I say below, it's essentially the same as setting gin traps for all predators around Skukuza. There's no difference. You wipe out the predators or wipe out the prey, you're going to start destroying the predators as well. Great whites are being killed. And this will give you a very good example of just to the extent that they're fishing De Hoop. If you look and you see the thin yellow line, that's De Hoop. They target the edges of the reserves. All the blue dots in the top right image are actually showing the vessel's presence along the edge and sometimes inside. And then the red dots here are where the vessel was actually caught poaching in the reserve. So what we've also done to try and highlight this is we launched a research project that we collaborated with the University of Miami on to show how the sharks are using these marine protected areas, and then also show how they use the adjacent areas and how species such as the smooth hammerhead overlap with the target species. And what we learned from this is by replicating the baits used and working over the same areas as the longliners, that it's impossible for them not to be catching and killing, which we know they are, literally hundreds, if not thousands, of hammerheads and protected species, because they co-occur and they co-feed in exactly the same environment. So where does it all go? Well, unbelievably, all the shark is going to Australia for fish and chips. It's often kept in the most unsanitary way or stored. And the South African shark has been tested to have 14 times the acceptable heavy metal levels that are allowed. So what that means is essentially diseases such as dementia and others are at far higher risk. A quick idea of what's happening in South Africa. You can see here no environmental assessment before the beginning of the fishery, no observers, no cameras, no TAC, no restricted areas around MPAs. There's no contribution to any sustainable management program, no complete records of the vessels, very little enforcement, very little fining or prosecution, even though there's a case underway, no health, sanitary and safety checks, and industry contributes less than $1 million to South Africa's dollars to the GDP. Sadly, the permits are owned by people with multiple other fishing rights. If you have a look at Australia, where the shark is going, it's carefully monitored. It's 100% video monitoring, observers, it's a seasonal fishery, strict TAC, strict enforcement, strict catch limits. They have to pay a mandatory 10% contribution to make sure there's video monitoring, marine parks, etc., etc. So sadly, to meet the demand, they're importing cheaply caught and cheaply managed sharks from South Africa. So at present, what we're doing to stop this is we've had massive exposure through a variety of different TV networks and newspapers, the huge petition in Port Elizabeth. We've launched vessels to photograph and document what's happening. We've completed a 2-year research project in De Hoop showing the importance to the area for the sharks. There's a website that I'd recommend everybody who wants to learn more about this has a look at, called sharkfreechips.com, that clearly explains everything. And the pressure that the public has created, because there are huge amounts of people upset about this, has forced the Minister of Environmental Affairs to convene an expert panel to address this issue. And currently there's pressure underway in Australia to ban the import of South Africa's sharks by, ironically, the Australian shark fishermen, who are very upset that this cheap product with very few environmental precautions is being imported. So what are we seeing in the absence of the great whites? Well, other species of sharks are now coming into these areas. We're seeing changes in seal behavior, and the smaller effects are certainly unknown. But I guess if you took all the impalas out of Kruger, leopards, wild dogs, and other animals that are highly reliant on them would start changing their behavior too. So from my side, I still have the opportunity to enjoy incredible sightings of these sharks, and as a fine art photographer, I utilize my images to hopefully showcase the beauty of these animals around the world. Spend a huge amount of time in the bush, also trying to collect images of animals that are under threat. And I think one of our biggest goals when we work with sharks is to try and position them in the same light as our terrestrial animals are seen. They're an incredible asset to South Africa, and we need to do everything we can to conserve them. South Africa is the most amazing location. There's so many places that are still yet to be discovered. This image, if you ask somebody where it was took, they would say Namibia, or maybe Morocco, Algeria, but it's in our backyard. There are dunes like this in De Hoop, off Port Elizabeth, and it's just the most amazing marine wilderness that we have off our coastline. The journey would never have been complete without my incredible and supportive wife and other people that have supported us, like Jeff Kerr, throughout all the documentaries. And to them, I'm incredibly grateful, not only to have an amazing partner like my wife, but also somebody who's fought so hard for the conservation of these animals as well. And for all of us, you know, each of us has got a special animal, and each of us has got a passion. And at the end of the day, our respective pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is one we really need to fight for. And I truly hope that in years to come, other young boys and girls will have the incredible privilege I've had to work with these remarkable animals. And I hope for generations to come, they're still there off our coastline. I really hope you've enjoyed my talk this evening, and I'd love to hear any questions any of you may have. Thank you.
Chris, this was such a beautiful talk.
Thank you.
I didn't know almost anything about sharks. The pictures you showed, it's just amazing. It's really breathtaking, everything you did and you do. I'm always overwhelmed by moments because I would like to say so many things. I want to go back to that Chris Murray said about this humbling experience, and I think you really nailed it with those words. For everyone who works in the field or in the water in this case, it is really humbling to be in touch with the nature and with this majestic animals. So I have a very, I hope, basic question, because you made this this relation with the lions. How much does a shark have to eat? How often does a shark hunt, or is it measurable anyway?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. The most we've ever seen a single great white shark hunt, we saw the same individual kill 2 seals in 11 minutes, and then I've seen the same shark kill 3 seals in 2 days. But it obviously varies on the size of the shark and the size of the seal that they're feeding on. But what we learned around Seal Island is certainly every few days, the same individuals would kill again. And what we learned there is that when the opportunity was available, I guess just like with most predators, they would cash in while they can. We also know that great white sharks undertake very long expeditions, sometimes across continents. There are records from South Africa to Australia, and probably during this time they'd have to undergo large periods without food. So, you know, I think it's a case of, as with most predators, when there's a chance to feed, they will. And with that whale carcass, we actually watched them feeding to the point where they couldn't actually eat anything more. They would swim into the whale carcass like a 747. They were so full, try and put their heads out the water, and it was like you try and eat that second or third hamburger, but you know you can't. We know you shouldn't, but you try anyhow. And then they would sink away to the depths. And so when the opportunity was there, you know, they really made the most of it.
Thank you, Chris. Rod, do you see any questions?
I don't see any other hands. If you just, anybody wants to raise their hand.
There's one in the chat, please. I'm just going to check. There's a question from Bridget Johnson. What did you use as seal decoys to observe the shark's feeding behavior, Chris?
So generally when we work with the seal decoys, we're trying to cut out something that looks as best as a seal can from underneath. We always use materials that are soft, that are not going to injure the animals in any way. What was really interesting, talking about seal decoys, is in the early years we were involved in a year-long shape discrimination study where we put out inanimate shapes such as a triangle and a square, and we towed those alongside, on the opposite side, a seal. And what we found, and it was done by the roll of a dice. So sometimes we'd go clockwise around the island, sometimes we'd go close, sometimes we'd go far, sometimes the triangle would be on the port side, sometimes the starboard side, and it was all with the roll of a dice, so there was no bias. And what we learned is when the targets are towed, provided they fell within a certain size range, it didn't make any difference what they looked like. The size was everything. But when they were stationary, the shark showed a very, very clear preference for something that looked like the natural shape of a seal. So if you put the square out in the seal shape, they virtually always went for the seal. So size was very important when they were actually targeting moving prey.
Thank you, Chris. Let's see if
Anybody else? Questions?
Ah, Cheryl, are you just waiting? Are you just waiting to say fantastic, or you're going to ask a question? Just accept unmute.
Chris, yes. One, I would like to say, it was amazing. Your talk's amazing. Your photography is amazing. But in December, I went down to Hart Bay, and for the first time in my life, I decided to go to Seal Island on one of their little tours.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit worried about the amount of diesel that's lying in the sea. That's the first thing. And I'll just like to know, these tour operators, I know, they've got to make an income, but what is the impact that they are having on the biodiversity, not to mention the seals and the sharks? That's the first thing. And also, is there any training programs that these guys have to undertake in order to actually operate these tours? Because I must tell you, we hit some rather amazing waves. I mean, I love the sea, and also diesel. So I was one of the unhappy clients on their boat, and I mean, I've got a big mouth and I don't keep quiet. So I voiced my opinion a little bit too loudly, but I mean, that's how I am.
Yeah, no problem. So Cheryl, let me answer. I actually saw Cleve Robertson was on here, and he could probably talk a little bit about what the requirements are in terms of diesel and keeping fuels and contaminants. You know, Cleve is the head of the NSRI, so he could talk a bit about that. But let me tell you, from the white shark tourism side of things, there's a very strict code of conduct that the operators have to adhere to. And in the early years, it was essentially, a bunch of cowboys. But in recent years, the operators have actually become a lot more responsible for their actions and how they certainly keep their vessels and how that they look after their clients, etc. But one thing that I feel is incredibly lacking in South Africa's marine conservation and tourism efforts is policies relating to how the animals themselves are treated. So there's a huge amount being done to make sure the vessels are safe, that tourists are looked after. But in terms of how the animals are treated, I think a massive amount more could be done by that. It's just like any industry, whether it's terrestrial with the safari industry or marine with the shark or whale watching, you get really great operators. I mean, there's one in Gansbaai I would actually like to single out called Marine Dynamics, who've put probably more back into marine conservation in South Africa than virtually anybody else and conduct themselves in a truly exemplary manner. And then, you know, there are others that are really bad that shouldn't have the privilege of working with these animals. And it really needs the regulatory body to actually go out on the boats and see how people treat the animals, be they seals, sharks, whales, or penguins, and weed out those people, because it's a privilege for someone like me and all the others that make an income out of sharks and wildlife to work with these animals. The Hout Bay guys have been running there for decades. You know, it's I think a lot of people get great pleasure out of seeing the seals, but I haven't been on those boats for, to be honest, must be 20 years. So I don't know what the educational component's like. I don't know how they were when they were around the seals in terms of, you know, the respect they show the animals, making sure that they're not going to run them over. You know, I think educational component's very important. And, you know, I speak from a shark point of view. Just the words you use will shape the way somebody will see that animal forever, you know. And we, with our company, try really hard to focus on the beauty of the animal, the predatory efficiency of the animal, and let people go home with, yes, an exciting experience, but an overriding appreciation of the animal. And I think, you know, I think it's very important that going forward, especially in a world that's moving towards greener alternatives and sustainability, that far more emphasis gets placed on how we treat the animals on our various operations.
Thank you, Chris. Bindi, you have a question. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Great, thank you. Chris, I'm from the States, and I have a question regarding the Fallon Islands off of California.
Yes.
And there'd be times for surfing that you don't go, you know, or you don't go to an area. So my question is regarding human and wildlife conflicts. And your experience around the world, was it just over media hype, or for my area, or was it actually happening that we had a higher occurrence of attacks by surfers who end up looking like flailing sea lions out on the water?
Sure. So the incidences of attacks on surfers and on bathers go through what are clearly patterns. In South Africa in 1998, we had 14 attacks. In the last few years, I'd say in the last 3 years, you could count the number of attacks on one hand. So you get these patterns, and we don't fully understand what the cause of the patterns is. But in South Africa, in the late 1990s, you were seeing a lot of white sharks up the south and east coast. And you know, when there are a lot of animals in areas with a lot of people, although the sharks are 99 out of 100, probably 999 times out of 1,000 not interested, just by virtue of the numbers, that 1% comes up more often than it does if there are very few people in the water. So, you know, it goes through these cycles, and we'll see it time and time again. With your question related to whether it's mistaken identity, you know, I'm quite contrarian with that, in that I don't believe an animal that's evolved over 400 million years in the case of sharks, and depending who you speak to, 60 million years in the case of great white sharks, doesn't know the difference between a seal and its normal prey. What we have noticed when we're working with white sharks and we're free diving with them is they'll constantly posture signal to us, and through their body mannerisms, we can understand, you know, what that animal's trying to tell us. Much like when you walk in the bush with a lion, you know, anybody's had experience there. You see a twitching tail, you see eyes folded back, you see the animal going into a crouch position. Those are all warning signs. And when you get too close to these animals, they exhibit those. It's either a flee or fight response. And in the case of the white sharks, we know that if we keep advancing on these animals, you know, they'll go into exaggerated patterns saying, keep your distance, keep your distance, keep your distance. And eventually will then bite you or try and launch an attack on you. And I think could be happening to quite a lot of surfers, is that the white sharks are around them all the time and they're exhibiting to these people, we hear move out of our space, move out of our space, and then they launch basically an attack on them. It's saying, get out of our area, because only 24% of all white shark attacks are fatal. Now, if these animals were hunting us for food, I can guarantee you, having seen so many attacks on seals, no human being would get away. The attack success would be high into the 90s. So it's clearly not motivated by hunger in virtually all cases. So it has to be something else. And, mistaken identity, a surfboard for a seal, possible, but I think it's selling the animal a bit short sometimes.
Fascinating. Thank you, Chris. There's a question from Pippa Haroff. Pippa, please accept unmute and then you can ask your question.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You're unmuted. We can't see you, but we can hear you. No,
yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Incredible presentation. Yeah. I don't know if you actually explained clearly why the breaching behavior. You said it's peculiar, particularly to the South African populations of great white sharks, but hardly observed elsewhere. Is it because of the behavior of the seals?
So it's a very good question, and it's an answer that is fairly complex, in that in different parts of the world they feed on different prey. So if we go to the Farallon Islands, which the previous guest spoke about, they're feeding primarily there on California sea lions and northern elephant seals, both of which are considerably larger than our Cape fur seals. So the strategy the great whites use there is they'll usually try and take out the locomotion of those animals and let them bleed out. So they bite off the hind flippers or give them a really bad bite, and then they move off, because those big seals pose a threat to the white sharks. They're very formidable predators themselves, and you wouldn't rush up at full speed and crash into them, because in the case of the northern elephant seals, they weigh the same as the white sharks. So it's a different strategy they use. Whereas at Seal Island in False Bay, your young of the year Cape fur seals only weigh about 20-25 kilograms. So a shark that weighs 1,000 kilograms is perfectly happy to rush up and grab them. They're inexperienced animals. They return and leave from the island in a different way to the adults. They generally porpoise more on the surface. They don't do protracted dives close to the island. You've got a size class of sharks that is different to, once again, the Farallon Islands or other areas, in that ours are around the South African coastline are generally juveniles or sub-adults, so highly athletic animals and capable of these tremendous bursts of speed. And then up until recently, you had very large numbers of great white sharks when compared to other areas in the world. So you had competition, the right size prey, perfect environment in the case of False Bay, deep water close to the island, and then the right age of athletic sharks. And it was, a perfect storm for the seals, in that all those things came together. When we've gone to New Zealand, the seals are a lot more spread out. You don't have these big focused seal colonies. So the great white sharks are picking seals off, once in a while when opportunity knocks. Not like at Seal Island, where they're focusing on knowing their environment incredibly well, stalking, ambushing, and launching these high-speed attacks. And then Guadalupe Island, they seem to predominantly be feeding on tuna in that area, although there are a lot of seals there. The operators don't see them catching the seals. It's usually feeding on tuna that they're scavenging. Australia, whilst there are quite a lot of seals in that area, operators don't see them feeding on them that much at all there. But there are large numbers of those smaller sharks I spoke about again. So it's a case of different strokes for different sharks in different parts of the world. They're all capable of breaching, but all the key components come together in False Bay and Mossel Bay like nowhere else on Earth.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Okay. We have Marty Jasper. Marty.
Marty.
Marty, you're alone tonight because Campbell is not on.
How's it, guys? Thanks, Chris, for a very interesting talk.
Thanks,
very
Marty.
enjoyable, and yeah, lots of facts there. Just I think become quite an unpopular habit of chumming. It used to be quite I think a common thing to try and attract great whites for the tourism and whatever. Is it still going on? And is it actually illegal? And I mean, I'm just sort of interested, I'm sure you know some more facts in terms of how far a shark can smell, you know, million parts of particles in the water, and how far they actually come when that sort of stuff goes on. And yeah, does the chumming that used to happen actually cause more humans to be attacked or anything like that? Just interested in that fact.
Yeah.
And then one other question, if I can. There's no sort of family structure in sharks. I mean, they basically have their pups, or I'm not too sure. Is it a mermaid's purse that the white sharks have, or is it live birth? But basically, then a baby shark is on its own. There's no sort of family. They don't ever like hunt in packs or anything like that. There's no family structure. I'm just interested if you could maybe tell us a bit about that.
Sure. So I'll start with your last question first. The great white sharks are born live, typically 7 to 9 young. They're born at a whopping 1.5 meters in length. And for the first few years of their life, they feed primarily on fish and small sharks. In fact, their dentition changes throughout their lives. So when they're born, they've got pretty narrow, I'll go that way around, otherwise I'm being rude. They've got pretty narrow shaped teeth, and for grasping prey, and as they get bigger, their teeth become wider, more for sawing and tearing up mammalian prey. So they basically ready to go, fighting fit from the youngest of days. What you see in various shark species is that the females will actually go through a period of forced delayed feeding, so they won't feed while they're dropping their pups, because a lot of females will drop their pups in the same areas, and that stops them actually killing and consuming their own young. So it's a protective mechanism. You do get a couple of shark species that congregate in large numbers, like scalloped hammerheads. Certainly during the sardine run, you get massive numbers of bronze whalers coming together, and whilst they don't cooperatively feed together, you get large numbers interacting and feeding in the same environment. Coming to a question about chumming, it depends on what you call chumming. If throwing large amounts of blood into the water, then that's generally what's perceived as chumming. That doesn't really happen anymore. It's now, the South African law only allows natural fish products. So at the end of the day, it's pretty much no different to fishing boats going out there and looking, when they're trying to attract fish. The problem really comes in with operators that actively feed the sharks. It's frowned upon in the industry. It's illegal. Very few do it, but it does occasionally still happen. But once again, there've been a lot of studies done, because it was, as you know, a highly controversial topic, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s. So there were 3 major scientific studies commissioned in South Africa to look into that, and they found no negative or altered response of the white sharks based on the chumming. And I think the main reason for this is that the operations occur where the great whites occur naturally. They're around the seal colonies, and whether the boats were there or they weren't there, the sharks would still be there. It's more a case with the industry of how the animals are actually handled than anything else. I think that's the biggest thing is, when the sharks are pulled into cages so that the people in the cage can get a better view, that's where then, and as I was saying to one of the callers earlier, it really is something that the regulatory bodies need to look at and enforce more vigorously is how these animals are treated. Because there are some operations that are truly fantastic, that give incredibly good educational tours, and then there's some that just really cater for the adrenaline seekers, you know, and much like the safari business, really good ones and really bad ones, and the bad ones need to be rooted out. But my quick answer to your question is no, chumming was never shown to lead to an increase in shark attacks.
Chris, thank you very much. At this point, it's 8:30. We are officially now finished with the talk show, but unofficially we can go on. So what we're going to do is just, again, unmute people, and we give Chris another round of applause for incredible talk. Chris, I can just say, really fascinating, professional, well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
We really
Thank you, Chris. That was excellent. Excellent.
Thanks, guys.
What we're going to do now, people will now be able to mute and unmute themselves if they want to chat away. More than welcome to do so. Also want to say that I see Enrico Gennari is still on. If he wants to come in, you refer to him in your talk, as well as Steve Robinson, if they want to come in for any comments they would like to make. So this is now just the informal chat. You can unmute yourself and ask Chris, or raise your hand and we can help you just to get into a queue for questions. Any more questions? Okay, seems to me
I'll ask again if
if you give Marty a chance to ask one question, he asks 10. I see Enrico is saying, ask your question, Marty.
We need to get our money's worth, you see.
We start paying for this.
Chris, you mentioned that sort of half cut off submarine with your rear end hanging out. That sounds like quite a close encounter. What maybe sort of close misses or anything else that, you know, exciting stories that you might have, near misses or a bit of a scratch here or there, or anything else that you might be able to tell us about that's a bit hair-raising, but yeah, still entertaining?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, over the years, there've been quite a few. I think the unexpected ones have, you know, probably been the most hair-raising, and that's when the sharks do what are known as natural breaches. They just jump out the water. It's not a predatory function. We think it might even be a social function, but we've had a couple of close calls where they've come incredibly close to actually jumping in the boat. And, you know, you've got 1,000 or 1,500 kilograms of shark landing 3-4 feet away from the boat. So we've had a couple of those over the years. Obviously, when I had a great white shark in a cage with me in 1994, that was I guess, an unnerving experience. It was in the early pioneering days. I was working with a guy called Craig Ferreira, who was one of the pioneers of the shark cage diving industry in South Africa. And we were guys in our early 20s, you know, we had no money. So we put together a cage that wasn't much more than chicken wire. And I think we used a piece of a roof rack or something. And anyhow, the shark broke into the cage, surprise, surprise. And I was pinned to the bottom of the cage, and the only way to get it out was I actually had to lift under the shark's jaw like this. And after 2 attempts, I actually managed to get it where its head was at the other port. Its tail came back into the water because it had been vertically out the water, and then broke open the other side of the cage and swam out. So that was a quick introduction to not make Don's discount shark cages anymore in the future. And yeah, I mean, it was pioneering days, you know, nobody knew what they were doing, and we just wanted to see sharks as young guys. And then, you know, I think the most amazing things in terms of escapes have actually been the natural stuff we've witnessed. You know, the sharks going for the seals, and you see a young seal at 6 months of age outwitting, outmaneuvering, and outlasting 4 different great white sharks. You know, and some of the chases are 5 minutes in duration, and this little guy's bouncing off the shark's snout, dodging and ducking and diving, and then that shark gets tired and leaves it and goes another 100 meters closer to the island, and another shark goes for it. And it was fascinating watching the people on board. You know, you'd have half the boat cheering for the shark, and then half the boat cheering for the seal, and you're actually doing more marriage counseling because the husbands and wives would be shouting at each other. And, you know, when that little seal got back to the island, you'd be cheering, and then sometimes after dodging 3 sharks, and it's 20 meters from the island, and it gets taken out. So, you know, watching nature do its thing for me was, yeah, it's the most dramatic, the rawest, most emotional. And, you know, 10,000 plus events later, I never lost my respect for the prey. You know, I always look at each one of those animals as an animal fighting for its life. And what they go through is incredible. You know, I mean, the seals are going out to sea 5-6 days at a time, feeding 50-60 miles offshore in the worst, some of the worst oceans of the world, and ever diminishing resources. And then after all of that, for the last few hundred meters, you've got to run this gauntlet of the ocean's most efficient predator. You know, yeah, you can only have huge respect for them.
I think all those guys going for the seals must have been Stormers supporters, eh?
Well, I think they were sharks. They were just happy that the sharks could catch something.
Enrico, I'm muting you. If you want to come in and just maybe just tell us what you do and share with us. Hello, Enrico.
Hello, hi. Sorry, I don't want to take Chris, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. And one thing I want to say is that Chris is incredible how no matter has got one of the most extended experience in the world in terms of white shark, it still seems when you're listening to him is like listening for the first time. It's just incredible. So I have a huge respect for it. Incredible. Now, I don't want to say too much. I just want to say that basically what Chris is doing is really trying to really change the not only the laws but the enforcement and the management. Even more importantly, is something that is really needed in South Africa for sharks and for the marine resources. A lot of attention is on the terrestrial side, and the marine side is unfortunately over the years getting worse and worse. So it's really a continuous battle that needs to be fought right now. And the more people, you know, the better. So yeah, I don't want to say much more than that. Thanks.
Thank you, Enrico, and thanks for what you are doing.
Absolutely. Chris, if I can just mention something there, that, you know, we've worked with a lot of scientists around the world, and generally scientists are about getting to an end result. But there've been a few scientists who really stood out in shark circles, and one has been a friend in the US, Dr. Neil Hammerschlag, and the other's been Dr. Enrico Gennari in South Africa. You know, really put their heads on the line. You know, scientists generally are relying on grants, and when you're relying on somebody else to pay the bills, you don't want to be too outspoken. But these guys have put their heads into the wind and are fighting government, are fighting sometimes their peers, and they're doing it because they believe in trying to conserve the resources. And, you know, yeah, Enrico's one of those guys. So thanks, Enrico.
Thank you, Chris.
Well done. Cheryl, Dr. Cheryl Ogilvie.
Yeah, hi, Chris. Yeah, I'm into environmental education in quite a big way. I believe in education starts at the very early years and in primary school and high school, and we carry on. Do you think by interlinking the importance of sharks or marine biodiversity into the school curriculum, do you think it could make a difference in maybe saving a lot of the species?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we only protect what we get exposure to, right? I mean, that's how you become passionate about something. So, as I guess if you had to ask virtually everybody on this panel this evening how they became passionate about wildlife, it was because somebody took the effort to teach them about it or show that animal to them. So undoubtedly, you know, if sharks were given a higher profile in terms of not just being these exciting animals, but more importantly, a keystone species in our environment, and one that needs to be conserved for so many reasons, be it tourism, be it ecological, or just ethical. I think it could only help, and I think it would be a fantastic step forward, and one that I think needs to take place sooner rather than later. So yes.
Thank you, Chris. Anybody else?
Yeah, can you hear me, Chris?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Any ideas why Carcharodon megalodon became extinct?
So there've been lots of theories on that, and one of which is that the prey that they were primarily feeding on, which were smaller cetaceans, their numbers ran out. And then there was also another theory that the waters started cooling to an extent that the animal couldn't sustain itself with. But I think there's so much speculative theory around why they disappeared that nobody really knows. I mean, if you look at the distribution of the animal, it's found in so many areas where the white sharks were. So why wouldn't they be able to survive, temperature changes? I mean, the white shark has got a remarkable range of temperatures that they can live in, from as low as 2 degrees to as high as 27 degrees. So I think it was probably a prey availability on some level, but nobody knows for sure. I mean, as crazy as it sounds, as a shark nut, my wife and I, we fantasize that one day at the back of our boat, waiting for a great white, this 45-foot long beast will arise from the depths. But yeah, I think those days are probably gone.
Thank you.
Pippa, are there any sharks in your fossil field?
Yeah, we've got a lot.
A lot.
Yes, we've got about 14 different species, including Carcharodon megalodon and great white. Yeah.
Where do you get most of your megalodon teeth from, Pippa?
Where people are collecting them around Milnerton. Okay,
at the lagoon mouth.
Yes, the museum's got about 7. We've only got half a tooth that was found in the mining times.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, since I've been up here on the West Coast, a policeman found the best tooth I've ever seen between Saldanha and Langebaan.
Oh, really? On the beach?
Yeah, on the beach.
Wow, I know that diamond miners up at Port Nolloth were occasionally getting them in their pipes when they were scooping up, obviously, the alluvial diamonds, and then they were sorting the gravel. They were getting them there. And then there are a couple of guys in North Carolina that actually take tourists out, and they go quite a long way offshore. I think it's something like 20 miles, and they take marine scooters, and they turn them around and they use them as fans to blow away all the sediment and all the gravel. And they come up sometimes with a packet full of megalodon teeth. I mean, it's incredible. It's one of the most beautiful fossils, a perfect megalodon tooth. And they come up with a whole bag full, and it's incredible to think that there were probably a lot of those animals around at one time.
It is amazing. Yeah. Of course, here in South Africa, as you know, it's illegal, but it's going the collecting and trading in South African fossils.
Yeah, I'm sure it still happens to a large degree.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.